Beneath the bustling streets of Manhattan's Lower East Side, where trendy boutiques and cafes now line the sidewalks, lie the buried remains of one of America's most unsettling forgotten institutions. Between 1834 and 1867, the Sanctuary for the Reform of Wayward Women operated in secrecy, overseen with brutal efficiency by the Donnelly family. Posing as a Christian rehabilitation center, it promised to save fallen women through faith and discipline. Official records state that 456 women passed through its gates. Only 127 ever walked out alive. For over 3 decades, the Donnelly family built a system so perverse, so calculated in its cruelty, that when investigators finally breached the property, the evidence they uncovered defied the boundaries of human depravity. The full truth of what occurred behind those sacred walls remained locked away in sealed court files for nearly 100 years, until a construction crew excavating a foundation in 1934 unearthed subterranean chambers that exposed the true horrors of the Donnellys' reign. Before we continue with the chilling story of Warden Elias Donnelly and the twisted empire his family ruled, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss one of our darkest historical mysteries. Let us know in the comments which state you're listening from. You might be surprised how close these events came to your own hometown. What the Donnellys built was far more than a house of correction. It was a finely tuned apparatus of exploitation so vile that even hardened criminals might shudder at the details. New York City in 1834 was a breeding ground for moral panic and religious obsession. The Second Great Awakening had swept through America like a spiritual wildfire, leaving in its wake a society fixated on sin, repentance, and soul cleansing. The city's population had swelled past 300,000 packing families into filthy tenements where poverty festered like mold behind the walls. Every day, ships delivered wave after wave of Irish immigrants escaping the potato famine, soon to ravage their homeland human cargo unloaded onto the docks like sacks of grain. And in this storm of social unrest and religious zeal, Elias Donnelly, a former prison warden from Galway, Ireland, saw an opportunity to elevate his family to untold wealth and power. Elias stood 6'3" with a presence that seemed to draw all light inward. His hands, gnarled and scarred from years in Ireland's infamous Loughmore Penitentiary, could snap a woman's wrist, like kindling. A ragged scar tore across his face from ear to jaw, a souvenir from a prisoner's failed escape. But it was his eyes, icy blue and utterly lifeless, that betrayed the beast beneath his righteous facade. When he spoke of God's will, his voice rang with the certainty of a man who believed himself divine retribution incarnate. He'd learned his trade in the old country, where rebels and political prisoners taught him that every soul has a breaking point, and with the right mix of pain and manipulation, that point could always be found. His wife, Maura Donnelly, had refined the art of cruelty disguised as care during her years supervising a women's workhouse in Boston's Irish Quarter. She was unremarkable in stature but possessed an eerie charisma. She could ruin a woman's spirit with a whisper and a false smile. Her lips often curved upward, but her black eyes sparkled only when witnessing someone else's suffering. There was something almost ecstatic in the way she watched humiliation unfold. Maura understood what most didn't, that breaking a woman required precision. Too much pressure and they'd collapse into madness useless. Too little and they'd cling to hope dangerous. She had studied the Magdalene asylums of Ireland, where women were worked to death beneath a veil of sanctity, and brought those methods to America, adding her own uniquely perverse improvements. Completing the unholy trinity was Elias's younger brother, Father Simon Donnelly, the institution's spiritual overseer. Where Elias brought brute force and Mora delivered psychological manipulation, Simon added something even more insidious: intellectual sadism. His theological justifications transformed torture into ritual, elevating brutality into a twisted form of sacred theater. Simon Donnelly, once a gifted seminarian with a razor-sharp intellect, had long since descended into theological madness. Expelled from 3 different religious institutions for what instructors cautiously labeled unorthodox interpretations of Scripture, Simon had been molded not by faith, but by rejection and resentment. His sermons had an eerie power. Women would collapse into fits of weeping, confessing sins they had never committed simply because his words struck nerves they didn't know existed. Simon's grasp of psychology was chilling. He could isolate a woman's deepest fears, shame, abandonment, worthlessness, and press against them with the precision of a surgeon. Fluent in the texts of nearly every major denomination, he could twist any doctrine into justification for horror, using the victim's own beliefs as weapons against them. What set him apart wasn't his knowledge, but his purpose. He had studied the Spanish Inquisition not as history, but as a manual for shattering the human soul. The Donnelly operation reached a new level of sophistication when Elias's eldest son, Nathaniel Donnelly, returned to New York after a failed venture in Boston's shipping industry. Nathaniel had ambition that dwarfed his father's brute savagery. Though his business had collapsed, he came back with a Rolodex of corrupt aldermen, police commissioners, and merchants who would become vital to the family's enterprise. More importantly, he brought with him a Harvard education and a cold-blooded understanding of how money and favors flowed through the veins of New York's political machine. Where Elias ruled through force, Nathaniel ruled through erosion. He had learned that power wasn't about breaking bones, it was about breaking wills. He believed the key to control was complicity. Make your victims participate in their own degradation and they will never rise against you. From his failures in commerce, he'd learned the value of diversification and strategic cruelty lessons he now applied to human lives with brutal efficiency. The last and perhaps most terrifying member of this malignant family was Eleanor Donnelly, Elias's sister-in-law and Mora's closest confidant. Eleanor was the institution's silent blade, shaped by a past so nightmarish it had hollowed her into something inhuman. She had survived a transatlantic voyage from Ireland aboard a disease-ridden immigrant ship, where cholera had wiped out half the passengers, including her husband and 2 young children. What came off that ship was no longer a grieving mother, but a woman who saw suffering as weakness and weakness as sin. She interpreted survival as divine selection and viewed pain as a purifier. Her knowledge of herbs, crude surgery, and battlefield medicine, acquired during the voyage out of sheer necessity, was sharpened into a skill set that allowed the Donnellys to keep their victims alive far beyond their natural endurance. Eleanor acted as the institution's medical overseer, granting her unrestricted access to every woman that entered their fortress. She recorded physical and mental deterioration, not as a healer, but as a scientist refining a cruel experiment. The Sanctuary for the Reform of Wayward Women officially opened on a bitter February morning in 1834. The structure it occupied was a hulking 4-story brick monolith that had once housed a textile factory. Its location had been carefully selected near enough to the city's center to remain accessible to clients and officials, but just far enough from polite society to stay unnoticed. The building itself was a symbol of New York's rapid industrial evolution. Erected in 1820 for mechanized production, it was abandoned when factories in Massachusetts outcompeted it. But for the Donnellys, it was perfect a forgotten shell, waiting to be repurposed for something much darker. Its windows were sealed with bricks, leaving only slitted openings that barely allowed light to slip through. It was enough to navigate the halls, but not enough to track time or weather. The disorientation was by design. Cut off from the rhythm of daylight, the women inside gradually lost their grip on days' weeks' reality itself. That vulnerability made them easier to control. The Donnellys had spared no expense in soundproofing. Thick wool insulation filled the walls, stifling even the loudest screams. Inside, the corridors were painted in deep, oppressive tones that absorbed what little light existed, casting everything in a permanent gloom. The darkness wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Even before the first blow or command, the building itself began the process of breaking those who entered. Outwardly, the Donnelly institution presented itself as a beacon of modern moral reform. A progressive sanctuary, they claimed, where women guilty of prostitution, infidelity, public drunkenness, or so-called moral failings could find salvation through prayer, honest labor, and Christian instruction. To judges, police officials, and troubled families, the Donnellys marketed their services as a compassionate alternative to the disease-ridden wards of Blackwell's Island or the overcrowded city jails. They circulated pamphlets boasting of miraculous recoveries and distributed testimonials penned by supposedly reformed women praising their revolutionary blend of Christian love and discipline. But what made their enterprise truly insidious wasn't just the facade. It was the legal scaffolding that held it up. New York's moral reform laws of the 1830s granted sweeping powers to any religious organization claiming to offer rehabilitation. The Donnelly family had studied these laws with surgical precision, crafting their charter to exploit every loophole. Once a woman crossed their threshold, she effectively vanished from the justice system. There were no fixed sentences, no oversight, only the Donnellys' discretion to release her, if ever. The laws were written so broadly that nearly any act could be construed as moral depravity. Speaking too freely in public, walking alone after sunset, accepting a drink from a man, all could result in institutionalization. The entire operation rested on a web of corruption that reached from the filthy gutters to the marble halls of Albany's elite. And it was Nathaniel Donnelly who wove that web with the patience of a spider. For years, he cultivated alliances with precision, knowing that every handshake, every favor reinforced the family's position and made them increasingly untouchable. These men didn't just tolerate the Donnelly operation, they were its patrons, its protectors, and often its most devoted customers. One of the most valuable was Judge Horace Langford of the Manhattan Criminal Court, a man revered as a moral crusader and devout Presbyterian. Langford was the perfect mask of respectability. In truth, he was a predator. His courtroom was his hunting ground. He routinely sentenced young women to the Donnelly institution for offences as vague as public boldness or being seen in the company of men. Those without families, without voices, those were his favorite prey. Unbeknownst to the public, Langford received regular updates on each woman's progress and paid vast sums for private viewings, where he could personally supervise their so-called rehabilitation. He devised complex legal justifications to prolong sentences, indefinitely ensuring his preferred victims remained available as long as his appetites endured. Then there was Captain Alistair Wren, commander of the 8th Precinct, who controlled the flow of arrests. The city's morality laws, vague by design, were his playground. His officers were trained to single out particular women, those who were foreign, poor, isolated. Irish and German immigrants were especially vulnerable. Wren developed a system of manufactured guilt. A folded love letter became adultery, a wine glass proof of addiction, a polite conversation with a man's solicitation. His officers maintained exhaustive files on potential targets, daily routines, financial dependence, known male acquaintances. It was police work turned into predatory surveillance, precision hunting, under the guise of justice. But the Donnellys' reach extended beyond corrupt courts and crooked cops. Their clientele included some of New York's most revered businessmen, physicians, and clergymen whose reputations for moral rectitude made their private degeneracy all the more grotesque. Among them was shipping magnate Lawrence Wexler, a titan of transatlantic trade. Every Tuesday evening, without fail, Wexler arrived to counsel the newest arrivals, paying more than a dock worker earned in a month for the privilege. The Donnellys catered to his specific repulsive preferences with calculated precision. His wealth insulated him from scrutiny, and his connections rendered him immune to consequence. There was also Dr. Malcolm Price, a prominent figure on the city's Board of Health. His medical evaluations determined which women were fit for the Donnellys' most profitable services. He also ensured that any illnesses acquired during captivity remained confined so paying clients wouldn't be inconvenienced. But perhaps the most grotesque betrayal of all came from Reverend Tobias Granger, pastor of one of Manhattan's largest Methodist congregations. His involvement gave the institution a cloak of divine legitimacy. He led public prayers for the Donnellys, blessed their work from the pulpit, and used his influence to silence dissent within the religious community. Granger's sermons praised the house as a necessary moral refuge. In reality, his private visits were anything but spiritual. Reverend Tobias Granger's role in the Donnelly Empire extended far beyond religious endorsement. He was not merely a silent accomplice, he was an active participant. From the pulpit of his Grand Methodist Church, Granger didn't just preach about sin. He turned his sermons into subtle traps. Young women who sought his guidance for personal struggles were declared spiritually diseased and sent away for rehabilitation. The congregation trusted him without question. Granger's weekly sermons fixated obsessively on the dangers of moral decay among unmarried women. He painted virtue and vice in such stark contrast that he turned his parishioners into informants. Eager to cleanse their community, families began reporting their own daughters, nieces and neighbors, believing they were saving them from damnation. Granger's reputation among clergy was so exalted that ministers across the city began referring troubled women to the Donnelly facility, never suspecting what fate awaited them behind those locked doors. But the corruption didn't end in the pulpit. It had reached the very heart of New York's fledgling social reform movement. Eleanor Donnelly, medical overseer of the house and sister-in-law to Elias, served on the board of the Ladies' Moral Reform Society. This organization was founded to protect and uplift vulnerable women. Instead, Eleanor used her position to identify ideal targets, those without families, those in despair, those seeking help, and quietly redirected them into the Donnellys' clutches. To the public, Eleanor appeared as a champion of women's welfare. Her carefully crafted persona shielded her from scrutiny. Through the society, she had access to sensitive files, personal histories, and confidential testimonies. She used that data to map out the most vulnerable in the city, a hunting list disguised as charity work. The irony was unbearable. The very institutions created to rescue women had been turned into feeding grounds by the monsters who claimed to protect them. Meanwhile, Nathaniel Donnelly ensured that their operation remained financially impenetrable. He had built financial alliances with banks and investment houses across the city, laundering blood money into pristine assets. One of their most valuable partners was the Merchants Bank of New York, led by President Samuel Rothwell. Rothwell accepted large, untraceable deposits from the Donnelly estate, without a single question asked. Those funds were quietly reinvested in transatlantic shipping routes, real estate and government bonds transforming suffering into dividends. This financial web not only sanitized their revenue, but made the Donnelly fortune appear wholly legitimate, untouchable by auditors or regulators. It wasn't just money laundering, it was image laundering. They had engineered an empire so intricately that even the taxman would applaud their efficiency. Inside the walls of the House of Moral Reform, life followed a rigid architecture of degradation. Every moment, every space was designed to erode identity and resistance. The process began the moment a woman crossed the threshold. From that point on, she no longer existed as a person. She was a case file, a product, a body. The first step was what the Donnellys called intake, though it more closely resembled a ritualistic breaking of the spirit. Women were led blindfolded and silent to the lowest part of the building, a windowless cellar, known euphemistically as the purification chamber. It was here that Eleanor conducted a grotesque routine disguised as medical and spiritual examination. The women were stripped naked under the pretense of hygiene checks. Eleanor would probe and prod them while documenting everything: skin tone, eye color, body shape, identifying marks, signs of childbirth or previous trauma. These details were meticulously catalogued into a personal dossier. But this wasn't for treatment or care, it was a menu. These profiles were distributed among the Donnelly family's elite clientele, allowing them to select victims according to their twisted preferences. Following the physical violation came what Simon Donnelly referred to as the spiritual assessment. But this was no soul-saving rite. It was a psychological interrogation weaponized through years of study and cruelty. Simon could peel apart a person's mind with frightening efficiency. He probed for fears, religious guilt, family vulnerabilities, hopes for redemption, any fragment of humanity that could be twisted into a leash. Some women were manipulated through the promise of salvation. Others were threatened with harm to siblings or parents. Still others were promised release. That would never come. Simon's notes determined each woman's trajectory, how they would be controlled, how long they could endure, and when they would break. His assessments weren't just evaluations, they were blueprints for destruction. Even the building itself was part of the machinery of madness. The layout had been deliberately engineered to produce disorientation and helplessness. Hallways twisted into dead ends. Stairwells looped to nowhere. Rooms were mislabeled, creating a constant sense of confusion. No sense of direction. No grasp of time. The women could not tell night from day or Monday from Sunday. This spatial chaos had a singular purpose to destroy any sense of agency. If a woman couldn't even find her way back to her own bed, how could she ever imagine escape? To the outside world, the House of Benevolent Restoration appeared to be a sanctuary for the fallen and enlightened institution where women accused of prostitution, public drunkenness, adultery, or so-called moral decay could be restored through prayer labor and Christian discipline. Behind its polished image, however, lurked a machine of cruelty, cloaked in scripture and powered by a web of corruption that reached from back alley patrolmen to the highest echelons of New York's elite. The Cavendish family, specifically its patriarch Alistair Cavendish, brilliantly marketed the institution as a humane alternative to the squalor of Blackwell's Island or the brutality of the city's overcrowded prisons. Their glossy pamphlets boasted testimonies from allegedly reformed women, their narratives polished and rehearsed, portraying miraculous transformation through God's love and industrious living. They lobbied judges, charmed police commissioners, and seduced charitable societies with their carefully cultivated image of benevolence and spiritual service. But it wasn't goodwill that fueled their success. It was law, specifically the vague and dangerously broad Moral Reform Acts of the 1830s. These statutes granted religious institutions sweeping authority over any woman deemed morally unfit, a classification so subjective it became a weapon. The Cavendishes had studied the law with surgical precision and engineered their charter to exploit every loophole, every grey area. Once a woman crossed their threshold, she ceased to exist in the eyes of the state unless Alistair Cavendish deemed her fit for release. Judicial partners were easy to find. Chief among them was Judge Nathaniel Greaves of the Manhattan Criminal Court, a man so revered for his piety that his sermons on moral reform were printed in newspapers. Greaves became one of the institution's most prolific suppliers of victims. For crimes as trivial as walking alone at night or arguing with a man in public, young women, especially immigrants, and the poor were sentenced to indefinite confinement. Courtroom records showed little more than case numbers and vaguely worded charges. What they didn't show was that Greaves received detailed reports on each girl's progress and paid exorbitantly for private audiences under the guise of spiritual supervision. Captain Silas Dawn, who oversaw a precinct covering the Bowery, orchestrated the street-level abductions. Under his command, patrolmen enforced morality codes, selectively targeting women who were poor foreign or simply too alone to defend themselves. A glance, a glass of wine, even a letter could be twisted into evidence of corruption. His officers were trained to identify specific target profiles: Irish maids, German seamstresses, runaway daughters. Dawn kept files on hundreds of potential victims, tracking their habits, weaknesses, and social status to ensure a constant pipeline of women into the House of Benevolent Restoration. And the clients, they came from every walk of high society: shipping tycoon, Montgomery Vale reserved Tuesday evenings for his spiritual volunteer work, paying more than a common laborer made in a month for the privilege of counseling new arrivals. The Cavendishes tailored victims to his grotesque tastes, and Vale's fortune ensured silence from any who might have dared to intervene. Dr. Clarence Wexley, a respected voice on the city's health board, performed medical inspections. His role officially was to assess health risks. Unofficially, he determined which women were suitable for the family's most lucrative operations and ensured diseases didn't reach the clientele. But perhaps the most chilling collaborator was Reverend Malcolm Breyer, pastor of the largest Methodist congregation in Manhattan. With a voice that could stir tears from stone, Breyer publicly championed the House of Benevolent Restoration as the Lord's instrument for purging sin. Privately, he supplied its ranks from within his own flock. Young women who sought his counsel for doubts or depression were quietly labeled unclean and referred for redemptive isolation. His sermons warned of the rising tide of female immorality, creating a culture of vigilance that made neighbors suspicious and families quick to accuse. His reputation carried such moral weight that other pastors referred troubled women to the Cavendishes without hesitation. Meanwhile, Mary Cavendish sat on the board of the Ladies' Moral Society, identifying vulnerable women seeking help and redirecting them into the family's clutches, an irony lost on all but the victims. Behind it all, Alistair Cavendish wove a vast financial web. His money, extracted through forced labor and client donations, was funneled through banks like Metropolitan Merchant House under the leadership of Samuel Rothwell. Rothwell accepted massive deposits, no questions asked, and reinvested them into real estate government bonds and transatlantic shipping. This laundering operation masked the Cavendish's profits as legitimate earnings, shielding them from scrutiny. But within the institution, away from polite society and polished sermons, a different reality unfolded, one deliberately engineered to crush the human spirit. The building itself was an instrument of torment, designed to confuse and isolate. Corridors led to blank walls. Staircases turned back on themselves. Rooms bore no names. Lighting was faint and uneven, casting long flickering shadows that blurred memory and direction. The result was perpetual disorientation, no bearings, no control, no hope. Women were stripped of their names and identities. They became numbers. Their belongings, no matter how sentimental, a mother's necklace, a wedding ring, were cast into fire during what was called the purification rite. Patrick Cavendish would lead the ceremony with grave solemnity, delivering homilies about rebirth, while the women were forced to watch the last pieces of their former lives burn. Their new lives began at 4 a.m., with 2 hours of forced confession and prayer. These sessions, led by Alistair's son Jeremiah Cavendish, were brutal psychological gauntlets. Women were compelled to confess sins they hadn't committed, to proclaim their own unworthiness until the lies became truth. Their statements were recorded and filed away, not for forgiveness, but to justify their continued imprisonment. Breakfast was a grey-spoiled porridge and crusts of moldy bread, just enough to keep the body alive, but never enough to fuel rebellion. Malnourishment was strategic. Hungry women don't run. Mornings were spent laboring in laundries, garment workshops, and rudimentary factories. Every stitch, every scrubbed sheet was $1 in Cavendish coffers. Working conditions were hellish, unventilated rooms, caustic chemicals, and endless hours bent in submission. Afternoons brought another kind of labor, psychological. Jeremiah Cavendish delivered daily sermons on the nature of sin and salvation drawn from torture manuals used by inquisitors centuries before. Guilt was the gospel. Shame was the sermon. Women stood for hours as he described their moral filth, insisting their pain was a gift from God. And then came night. The personal guidance sessions. Women were told these were acts of charity moral interventions by wealthy Christian men offering wisdom. What they endured instead was abuse dressed in robes of righteousness. The basement rooms were outfitted not for counseling, but for commerce, where human souls were traded like meat. Each woman had a dossier: hair color, temperament, submissiveness. Some men paid more for the shattered and obedient. Others paid more for those who still fought back. And always the Cavendishes watched, counting coins, recording preferences, and perfecting their system. The Whitlock family catered to every deviant desire imaginable, transforming what should have been a sanctuary for healing into a grotesque marketplace where women were bartered and sold like livestock. What made their operation uniquely sinister wasn't just the scale of the abuse, it was the holy mask it wore. Every act of degradation was veiled in religious authority. Each torment sanctified by scripture, twisted into chains. Victims were told that to resist was to rebel against God Himself. Their agony, the Whitlocks preached, was not punishment, but purification. Their submission was framed as holy obedience, a sacred duty that would cleanse their wickedness. What began as captivity soon blurred into spiritual confusion as the women were psychologically dismantled and rebuilt in the image of their tormentors. Reverend Silas Whitlock, with his deep command of theology, was especially skilled at manipulating scripture. He could quote chapter and verse to justify any abuse, no matter how perverse, convincing the vulnerable that their pain was divinely ordained. For many, the trauma wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, the kind of soul-deep despair that corrodes even memory. But just when we believed we'd seen the worst of the Whitlock family's wickedness, a discovery changed everything: their meticulous system of record-keeping. What lay in those files was not merely evidence, it was a blueprint of cruelty, dressed as commerce. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with someone who enjoys uncovering the darkest corners of history. Hit the like button to support our work, and don't forget to subscribe, because we're only just beginning to uncover what those secret ledgers revealed. The Whitlock enterprise wasn't some disorganized exploitation ring, it was a business. A refined, meticulously managed operation that blended piety with profit in ways that would have impressed the most ruthless industrialists of the Gilded Age. Edmund Whitlock, educated at Yale and trained in corporate finance, applied the logic of capitalism to human suffering. To him, these women were not victims. They were assets. The family maintained 3 distinct sets of financial records, each crafted to serve a different audience. The first, available for casual inspection by auditors or charitable boards, reflected a modest non-profit revenue from rehabilitation programs, donations from churchgoers, and income from the sale of goods allegedly produced by reformed women learning honest trades. The second ledger, shared only within a trusted circle of crooked politicians and complicit lawmen, documented the darker side of the business protection money bribes and payouts to keep patrolmen, judges, and social workers looking the other way. But the third ledger was something else entirely. Hidden behind a false wall in Edmund's private study, discovered only decades later during the building's renovation, it chronicled the family's true income from what they euphemistically labeled spiritual consultations. That book revealed the full scope of their empire. In modern currency, the revenue totaled tens of millions, enough to make the Whitlocks one of the most lucrative criminal syndicates of their era. The ledgers detailed a tiered client system, structured with the cold precision of a subscription-based service. Every membership level offered varying degrees of access and control, carefully designed to maximize both income and secrecy. The basic tier, marketed to junior bureaucrats and modest businessmen, granted access to group reform sessions where multiple clients could observe public humiliations presented as moral instruction. These were staged to appear educational, an opportunity to witness the redemptive power of repentance. In reality, they were performances of domination where pain masqueraded as piety. The premium tier, priced for merchants, landowners, and higher clergy, included private sessions, detailed behavioral reports, and influence over how a specific woman was to be reformed. Clients could select from an internal catalog, complete with physical descriptions, personality, summaries, and supposed moral failings. But the platinum tier, the highest level, offered privileges so disturbing they defy comprehension. Members in this elite circle were allowed to participate in the intake process itself, selecting victims fresh from the street and dictating their entire rehabilitation journey. These clients became gods in miniature crafting, psychological torment, tailored to personal vendettas or perverse fantasies, all under the guise of moral salvation. And there were specialty services too. For an added price, clients could take part in staged religious rituals led by Reverend Silas himself. Rituals designed to simulate divine judgment, where participants played executioner under the pretense of spiritual authority. Others paid to exact revenge on specific women who had humiliated or rejected them in the outside world. The Whitlocks weaponized piety, turning the institution into a theater of personal vengeance cloaked in ecclesiastical dignity. Most horrifying of all were the educational packages, custom experiences sold to those curious about human suffering. For a premium, clients could observe the entire arc of a woman's degradation, from her arrival to her resistance to her eventual breakdown and submission. The Whitlocks turned human agony into a spectacle, but their ambition didn't end in Manhattan. Edmund Whitlock forged partnerships with like-minded institutions in Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, creating an underground network where women were traded across state lines like cattle. Clients bored with local selections could request new material from other cities, while the Whitlocks quietly relocated women who had become unprofitable, too damaged, too aged, too defiant, to sister sites where they'd vanish without record. On paper, these were interstate transfers for specialized spiritual treatment. Under the law, fully legal. In reality, it was an invisible trafficking system protected by religious exemption and the apathy of officials who saw women's suffering as the price of public morality. The network the family established wasn't just for profit, it was a web of mutual protection. A crude but effective early warning system. Through it, institutions across several cities exchanged intelligence on suspicious inquiries and coordinated evasive actions whenever law enforcement got too close. But of all the horrors engineered by the clan, none were more chilling than what came to be known unofficially as the breeding program. Although never mentioned explicitly in their ledgers, Their euphemistic references and coded entries left no doubt as to what was occurring. Young women who became pregnant during captivity weren't released or cared for with dignity. Instead, they were isolated in locked attic quarters until they gave birth. Their children were then either sold to childless couples who believed they were adopting abandoned orphans, or kept and raised within the institution, groomed from infancy to become future victims or enforcers. This system served a trio of purposes. It created a steady source of income, provided a renewable supply of bodies for their operation, and allowed certain clients the perverse satisfaction of participating in what Father Silas Moreau once described as holy renewal through suffering. Dr. Edith Moreau, who oversaw this segment of the business, approached the task with chilling professionalism. She applied the same surgical discipline to this horror as she did to her supposed medical duties. She kept fastidious records charting menstrual cycles, pregnancies, and even the physical traits of the mothers as though she were breeding livestock. Her knowledge of herbal remedies and early medical techniques gave her the power to terminate pregnancies quietly or ensure successful deliveries based solely on the family's economic interests. The children born into the house were raised to believe they were the lucky survivors of destitution, rescued from the streets by the moral charity of the Moreau family. They were taught obedience, not affection, indoctrinated rather than nurtured. But the family didn't limit their profits to what occurred behind the house's doors. Genevieve Moreau, another prominent figure in the operation, signed contracts with prominent businesses offering so-called reformed women as labor: seamstresses, servants, factory workers. These women, broken, obedient, silent, were ideal employees in the eyes of their oblivious employers. They never protested, they never stole, they never quit, because they knew that worse punishment awaited them if they did. The women themselves believed that any disobedience, any questioning, would bring about a punishment worse than death, because they had seen it happen. Meanwhile, at the docks of New York Harbor, Thomas Moreau had refined what would now be called human trafficking. Working closely with shipping captains and corrupt immigration officers, he funneled newly arrived immigrants, especially young women, into the institution under the guise of offering safe housing or employment. These women, often without family language or money, were easily manipulated. The Moreau agents, dressed in clerical collars or nurses' aprons, scanned the docks daily, identifying the vulnerable and isolating them from others, before leading them to what they believed was sanctuary. But even this empire might have endured hidden behind religious rhetoric and bureaucratic cooperation if not for a confluence of events in 1866 that exposed everything. The unraveling began with a quiet whisper, not a shout, a shift in the political winds. Reformers began to rise in city government, and the old corruption networks that had shielded the Moreau family for over 30 years began to crack. Detective Elias Corrigan of the Metropolitan Police was the first to see the pattern. At first, it looked like a routine investigation, just another missing persons report filed by a grieving family. But something felt different this time. Women, especially Irish immigrants, were disappearing at an alarming rate in the lower wards, and their cases were consistently ignored until Corrigan's own niece, Bridget Donnelly, vanished after being arrested for drunkenness following her fiancé's funeral. Bridget was well respected, a seamstress, deeply religious, and never in trouble with the law. Her sudden arrest was strange, but her disappearance afterward was what truly disturbed Corrigan. He began pulling records, arrest logs, court dockets, transfer orders, and saw that many of the missing women had been charged with vague morality offenses and funneled into the House of Sacred Reconciliation. When Corrigan tried to visit the institution to check on Bridget's well-being, he was told she'd been transferred for specialized treatment. But there was no paperwork, no forwarding address, no name of the new facility. Corrigan's persistence unsettled Captain Benjamin Tully, a powerful figure in the city's corruption network. Tully feared that his long-protected ties to the Moreau operation might finally be uncovered. Things took a sharper turn when Corrigan partnered with Father Marcus Leclerc, a parish priest known for his advocacy of the poor and missing. Leclerc had been collecting names and stories from parishioners, many of whom had lost daughters, sisters, or nieces under similar suspicious circumstances. And he had begun to suspect that the missing women had not vanished, but had been systematically taken. He discovered that arrest records had been doctored. Witnesses were inconsistent or non-existent. Alleged victims of moral crimes were often described as pious, soft-spoken women with no history of misconduct. Faced with rising suspicion, Captain Tully made a desperate, catastrophic decision. He ordered the destruction of the House of Sacred Reconciliation, intending to set fire to the building, erase the evidence, and frame the blaze as an accident. The plan was clear: burn it to the ground in the early morning hours when few would be awake, ensuring maximum casualties and minimal questions. But Tully's plan failed. The fire set in the early hours of November 15, 1866, spread faster than expected. Nearby residents spotted the blaze quickly, and Fire Chief Patrick O'Dwyer, a man with an unblemished record and no ties to the corrupt network, answered the alarm himself. What he and his men found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As they broke through the smoke-choked corridors of the aging building, expecting only structural damage and perhaps a few casualties, they instead discovered a hell far worse: dozens of women chained in underground rooms that didn't appear on any official blueprints. Their screams weren't for help, they were cries of disbelief that someone had finally come. Their screams could be heard even over the crackling roar of the flames. Chief Fire Marshal Elias Donnelly immediately ordered his men to tear through every door and search every room, whether or not it appeared on the official blueprints. What they found behind those sealed and hidden spaces defied logic, decency, and even imagination. It didn't take long for the firemen to realize they hadn't stumbled into a tragic accident, but into a nightmare that had existed in the shadows for years. In the windowless depths of the basement, they found women in states of total collapse, some physically mangled beyond recognition, others staring blankly into the void, their minds clearly shattered by prolonged trauma. Some were shackled to walls, their limbs withered from years of immobility. Others bore marks, burns, cuts, scars that pointed to methodical torture administered over an extended period. It was clear these women had not been simply neglected. They had been systematically broken. The Carmichael family's reaction to the fire confirmed what no one wanted to believe. This wasn't merely negligence or institutional decay, it was intentional cruelty. Instead of helping rescue victims or salvage life-saving supplies, Thomas Carmichael was seen by multiple firefighters flinging ledgers and paperwork into the growing blaze. Meanwhile, His brother Silas was discovered ushering a handful of well-dressed men through a narrow stone passage, hidden behind a bookcase leading straight into the basement of St. Jude's Chapel next door. Their frantic efforts to erase their trail only validated the firefighters' deepest fears. Something monstrous had been happening inside that building. But it was Dr. Beatrice Carmichael's behavior that was the most chilling. When responders reached the infirmary wing, they found her calmly administering poison to the most gravely wounded women, murmuring that she was easing their suffering. She didn't tremble, didn't cry. Instead, she explained with eerie detachment that some of these women couldn't be allowed to speak, not if the family was to survive what was coming next. The horror unleashed by the fire couldn't be contained. By morning, word had spread across New York City like wildfire. No press embargo or well-placed bribe could stem the tide. The city's papers, once hesitant to investigate the Carmichaels due to their religious front and deep political connections, now competed viciously to reveal the ugliest, most scandalous details. Names, places, payments, everything. The New York Herald assigned its top crime correspondent, Henry Vaughan, to the case. Within days, Vaughan's investigative series began to peel back the curtain on a 3-decade-long criminal enterprise protected at the highest levels of government. He hunted down hidden financial records, tracked survivors into rural safe houses, and followed trails of hush money that led straight into the city's elite. His revelations were explosive. Bribes, fraudulent arrests, disappearances sanctioned by court order, church tithes that funded confinement facilities. Every layer of the city's power structure, police, judiciary, clergy, and commerce, was implicated in a web of organized human abuse. The initial reaction from readers was disbelief. Could so many supposedly moral, upstanding men and women really be involved in such barbarity? Then came the first high-profile death. Judge Alistair Pritchard, a towering legal figure known for his stern morality and ironclad rulings on decency, was found dead in his chambers, an apparent suicide. Hours before an arrest warrant had been signed in his name. His final act wasn't silence but confession, a lengthy handwritten letter admitting to his role in the Carmichaels' operation. Not only had he sentenced women to their facility under false pretenses, he'd also accepted direct payments for ensuring their silence afterward. The letter named dozens more. The New York Tribune breaking protocol published the suicide note in full, its horrifying details galvanizing public opinion. It was undeniable now. This had happened, and it had been going on for years. With Pritchard's letter as their map, authorities finally had the leverage they needed to take action. Arrests began to sweep across the city. Captain Thaddeus Crowley, long suspected of misconduct but never proven guilty, attempted to escape by boat with his family. He was captured at the docks with a valise packed full of foreign currency and ledgers detailing every bribe and favor he had received from the Carmichaels over a 10-year period. Faced with the threat of life imprisonment, and worse, Crowley began to talk. Not out of remorse, but out of cold calculation. He offered names, dates, meeting places. He diagrammed the Carmichael operation in stunning detail, becoming the star witness in a series of explosive trials that would rock New York's foundations. Over 40 officials were indicted in the months that followed, some quietly, others in chains and shame. The truth had finally emerged from the fire, and the city would never be the same again. The Murphy family could never have operated for over 30 years without the active collaboration of dozens of officials and the silent consent of hundreds more. Many chose to ignore disturbing rumors, turning away instead of asking difficult questions. Detective James Flanagan, the man whose relentless investigation finally exposed the Murphy empire, was promoted to captain. He would spend the rest of his career traveling across the country, unraveling similarly hidden abuses cloaked in religious or charitable veils. Flanagan's methods, listening to victims, tracing financial trails, and identifying behavioral patterns, became the foundation for how institutional abuse cases are investigated even today. Father Michael Ali, the priest who had quietly documented disappearances and irregularities, became a powerful voice for reform within the church. His tireless efforts helped institute stronger oversight, transparency, and accountability measures, making it far more difficult for predators to hide behind religious authority. But just when the world thought it had uncovered the full scope of the Murphy family's crimes, something else surfaced. In 1934, nearly 70 years after the institution had fallen, construction workers renovating a building on the site made a haunting discovery. Hidden behind a false wall in what had once been the basement of the House of Religious Correction was a sealed archive. Inside were hundreds of documents, photographs, and personal artifacts, evidence that would reopen old wounds and reveal a darkness even deeper than anyone had imagined. The archive held victim profiles, experimental records detailing techniques for breaking human will, and letters exchanged with similar institutions across the United States and Europe. The most chilling finds were hundreds of photographs, graphic, intimate documentation of systematic abuse, taken not just for record keeping, but for the twisted entertainment of select patrons. There were letters between the Murphy family and collaborators in London, Paris, and beyond, suggesting an international network of exploitation that thrived under the guise of religious care. These letters discussed the trafficking of victims' methods for avoiding detection and techniques for maintaining control. It became clear the Murphy family was not an anomaly. They were a link in a much larger chain of corruption. Shah Murphy's personal journals, found deep within the archive, offered perhaps the most disturbing insight. In these writings, he described his crimes not as evil, but as divine trials. He believed he was conducting religious experiments, testing faith, endurance, and redemption through cruelty. He wrote with cold precision about the effects of suffering, convinced he was refining souls, not destroying lives. The archive also included financial records that had been overlooked during the original investigation. These revealed that the operation was even more profitable than anyone had imagined. Beyond the institutional cover-ups and abuse, the Murphys were profiting from human trafficking and secret medical experiments conducted by unethical physicians. Adjusted for today's value, the family's earnings would be worth tens of millions. But perhaps the most heartbreaking discoveries were the personal effects of victims' letters from home never delivered religious medallions, worn family photos, and scraps of diary pages written in secrecy. These items gave victims back their names and identities, turning numbers in a ledger into real people, with families, memories, and dreams. This discovery prompted a new investigation by the NYPD's Historical Crimes Unit. Using modern forensic tools and historical research, they traced more victims, uncovered more accomplices, and connected unsolved cases in other cities to former members of the Murphy network. It was now undeniable some of the Murphy collaborators had escaped justice and continued their horrific work elsewhere. The Murphy case forces us to ask, how could such evil persist for so long? How many people turned a blind eye? How many still do? Psychologists and criminologists now study the case to understand how institutions can be weaponized. Historians analyze it to reveal how 19th century society, in its hunger for moral control, allowed abuse to flourish under a veil of virtue. The case reminds us that those who speak in the name of morality must be held to the highest scrutiny. The Murphy family's legacy is not just a tale of personal depravity, but a systemic failure where unchecked authority enabled years of suffering. And perhaps most disturbing of all this wasn't an isolated story. The correspondence in that hidden archive suggested similar institutions existed in major cities across the Western world, protected by legal loopholes and social silence. The Murphy family's victims weren't just the women who died within those walls, they were all of us. Every society that allowed such evil to exist bears some of the burden. Their story teaches us that when the most vulnerable are exploited, the very soul of a society is at risk. In the end, the reforms sparked by the Murphy case brought lasting change, stricter oversight, transparency laws, and the recognition of individual rights. But history warns us evil often hides in the guise of righteousness. It wears robes, recites prayers, and smiles while it destroys. So what do you think? Do you believe the full truth was ever revealed, or are there still secrets buried beneath New York's cobblestones? How many other institutions like the Murphys existed and were never caught? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you appreciate stories that uncover the chilling truths hidden in our history, subscribe to Sleepy History Tales. Ring the bell so you never miss an episode. Together, we'll continue shedding light on the forgotten corners of the past. Because sometimes, the most terrifying stories are the ones that actually happened. See you in the next video. The Ashcroft family, whose name had become synonymous with cruelty, cloaked in piety, proved surprisingly elusive when their empire finally collapsed. Their escape plans had clearly been in place for years, meticulously crafted, to allow each key member to vanish when the walls began to close in. Patrick Ashcroft's body was discovered among the charred ruins of the institution crushed beneath a collapsed beam. At first glance, it seemed he had died attempting to destroy evidence during the fire. But the coroner's report told a different story. Patrick had been struck in the skull with a heavy object before the fire reached him. It suggested that one of his victims, long brutalized and finally cornered, had seized a final chance at justice. Though investigators suspected several of the women, the true identity of his killer was never determined. Some bore wounds that could have come from a desperate struggle, but none confessed. Kathleen Ashcroft, the calculating matriarch, disappeared entirely. Despite an intense manhunt spanning multiple states and the involvement of federal marshals, no trace of her was ever found. Clues pointed in different directions. One trail led west toward California. Another hinted she had sailed to Europe under a false name, possibly aided by relatives who had emigrated decades earlier. Authorities discovered signs of a prearranged escape network, complete with forged documents. hidden funds, and safe houses prepared long in advance. Over the years, several women matching her description were detained, but none could definitively be linked to her. To this day, Kathleen Ashcroft remains one of the most wanted fugitives in American criminal history. 3 days after the fire, Elias Ashcroft was apprehended at a secluded monastery in upstate New York. There he had sought sanctuary from church authorities, presenting himself as a victim of anti-Catholic persecution. At first, sympathetic clergy protected him, invoking centuries-old traditions of shielding men of the cloth. But once the magnitude of the evidence emerged, even the most conservative bishops could no longer defend him. His trial drew national attention, not just for his crimes, but for the twisted theology he presented in his defense. Elias claimed their actions had been sacred trials of faith, insisting that suffering was the pathway to salvation. His calm demeanor, while describing ritual abuse, sent chills through the courtroom, revealing the horrifying extent to which religious authority had been weaponized. The most pivotal arrest was that of Thomas Ashcroft, the family's financial architect and keeper of secrets. His capture in Boston just hours before he could board a ship bound for Europe was a breakthrough. Detective Flanagan, already hailed as a hero, had tracked Thomas through a dense web of shipping contacts and old acquaintances. On him, they found ledgers, photographs, correspondence, and coded documents, proof of a sprawling business operation that had run uninterrupted for more than 30 years. The materials detailed everything: names of clients, lists of victims, dates, locations, payment records. With this evidence, prosecutors were finally able to build a case that reached far beyond the Ashcrofts, unearthing similar operations in other cities. Back at the site of the fallen institution, authorities found the final Ashcroft family member, Margaret. She was discovered in the basement infirmary, surrounded by the corpses of women she had drugged and poisoned. She sat quietly among them, brushing their hair and humming lullabies, lost in a delusion where she remained a caregiver. Psychiatrists soon determined that Margaret had suffered a complete mental collapse. Declared unfit to stand trial, she was committed to an asylum, where she spent her remaining days in a fog of confusion, insisting she had only ever tried to help the women find peace and grace. As news of the Ashcroft trial spread, the entire nation was captivated. Courtrooms overflowed with spectators desperate to hear survivor testimony, while journalists flooded into New York to chronicle what many were already calling the crime of the century. Each day brought new horrors to light: stories of torture masquerading as redemption of lives stolen under the guise of spiritual healing, of complicity reaching into the highest echelons of church and state. Survivors took the stand one by one, many speaking publicly for the first time. Their voices trembled with pain but never with doubt. They described underground cells, psychological torment, ritualized punishments, and the sheer indifference of those in power. What shocked the public wasn't just the cruelty, it was the scale and organization of it. The Ashcrofts hadn't acted impulsively. They had engineered an institution of terror, sanctioned by the law and protected by religious authority. Despite attempts by some to cast doubt on their claims, the overwhelming consistency of the testimonies and the corroborating physical evidence left little room for denial. Even the most hardened skeptics were forced to confront the horrifying truth. For over 30 years, one of the most brutal systems of abuse in American history had operated openly under the banner of salvation. Many of the women rescued from the blaze would later recount years of orchestrated cruelty experiences, so twisted and methodical they seemed almost too calculated to be born of mere malice. They spoke of friends who vanished overnight, of punishments passed off as spiritual purification, and of being coerced into grotesque rituals masquerading as religious rites. Their testimonies peeled back the final layer of the illusion that had protected the Alden family for decades, exposing a system of psychological domination that was as precise as it was inhuman. The techniques used to break their spirits were shockingly sophisticated for their time. A calculated mixture of physical torment, isolation, and constant indoctrination reduced the women to shadows of themselves. It was not simply about brutality, it was about erasing identity, silencing resistance, and building a new persona, shaped entirely by fear. Among the survivors was Margaret Flynn, niece of Detective Emmett Flanagan, who had only been confined to the Alden facility for a few short months before the fire. Her relative newness meant she still retained enough clarity to describe the early stages of psychological conditioning with unnerving precision. In court, she detailed the intake process, how each woman was stripped of her name, her possessions, and even her hair upon arrival. Days bled into nights through relentless schedules, sleep deprivation and forced confession sessions that broke down resistance through shame and staged absolution. Margaret's testimony struck a particularly damaging blow to the defense. She had been a respected seamstress and church volunteer, far from the kind of person the Alden family had claimed to be rehabilitating. Her presence alone undercut the narrative that their institution only housed society's deviants. Instead, she was living proof that the Aldens had preyed on the vulnerable and the innocent, not the wicked. Then came Elizabeth Rowan, a former school teacher who had endured over 3 years inside the Alden compound after a jilted suitor falsely accused her of moral impropriety. Elizabeth's clear, precise testimony not only outlined the systemic abuse she endured, but also exposed the Alden's client network in harrowing detail. She described how certain clients would order women based on profession background or even ethnicity, as if selecting items from a catalog. It wasn't just a prison, it was a boutique of suffering for the privileged. Elizabeth's testimony named names: politicians, lawyers, merchants, and even a theater impresario, men who had cloaked themselves in respectability by day and indulged in depravity by night. And among the most shocking was the revelation that Reverend Abram Whitlock, a well-known Methodist reformer, had not only supported the Aldens, but had played an active role in their crimes. Whitlock had long positioned himself as a champion of moral recovery, frequently delivering sermons about the redemption of fallen women. Yet, in court, survivors identified him as a frequent visitor, one who not only selected victims, but also personally participated in their abuse. When investigators seized his journals, they found chilling theological musings that rationalized his cruelty. In his writings, he spoke of the women as vessels of suffering made holy through purification. His words were scripture twisted into a license for torment. Whitlock's trial ignited public outrage. His lawyers argued that he had been deceived by the Aldens, led to believe he was aiding in reform. But the survivor accounts, the documents, the journal entries, it was too much to explain away. His conviction sent shockwaves through the city's religious communities and forever stained the reputation of the institutions that had once revered him. Meanwhile, financial records recovered from Nathaniel Alden's travel case painted a larger, even more sinister picture. The operation wasn't just local, it was national. Institutions bearing similar reformist names in cities like Chicago, Charleston, and St. Louis were linked by transfers of money, personnel, and ideology. The Alden family had not acted alone. They were part of a wider web, a hidden society built on exploitation sanctified by false morality and protected by wealth. The records uncovered from the Alden estate revealed an even darker truth. This was no isolated atrocity. Correspondence and ledgers showed that the Alden family had been in active communication with counterparts in Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, and several other major cities. These were not merely acquaintances, they were collaborators. Together, they exchanged tactics, transferred victims, and coordinated efforts to evade scrutiny from local authorities. This revelation triggered a wave of investigations across the nation. In city after city, investigators uncovered operations bearing unsettling similarities to the Alden's institutions, hiding behind a moral facade while profiting from degradation and psychological torture. Yet, as horrifying as those other programs were, none approached the sheer scale, efficiency, or cruelty of what had taken place under the Alden's control. The legal battle that followed was unlike any prosecution the state had ever faced. Much of what the Aldens had done operated within the shadowy protections afforded to religious rehabilitation institutions. The existing laws were simply not built to address the systematic psychological and sexual abuse of women under the guise of spiritual correction. Prosecutors were forced to innovate, building new legal frameworks and precedent-setting arguments to redefine what constituted criminal behavior when cloaked in religious justification. Defense attorneys tried to paint the Aldens and their associates as misguided reformers. They argued that their clients believed they were participating in moral rehabilitation, not exploitation. But the evidence told a different story. Mountains of financial records detailed vast profits generated from suffering. Victim accounts, uniform in their clarity and horror, revealed a calculated, sustained system of cruelty. The illusion of ignorance quickly collapsed. The sentences that followed were as harsh as the law could allow. And yet, for many, even the severest punishments felt pitifully inadequate in the face of such enduring and systemic evil. Silas Alden, the patriarch and self-styled prophet behind the operation, was hanged in 1868. Until the final moment, he proclaimed his innocence and railed against what he claimed was a conspiracy to silence true Christian discipline. His final address from the gallows was a disturbing sermon, a theological defense of his methods, and a prediction that future generations would one day recognize his twisted version of moral salvation as visionary. Nathaniel Alden, his brother and financial architect of the operation, received a sentence of life imprisonment. In 1882, his life ended violently in Singwell Penitentiary, the victim of an inmate attack. Rumors circulated that word of his crimes had reached the prison's general population and that his death had been a form of retribution even the guards quietly tolerated. Justice, however, was uneven. Several corrupt officials who had enabled the Aldens either evaded capture entirely or received only minor consequences. Some vanished across state lines before arrest warrants could be served. Others leaned heavily on political alliances that had been forged in backrooms and private clubs. Judge Ambrose Kent, one of the most deeply entangled figures in the corruption network, escaped trial altogether by taking his own life the night before testimony was to begin. His suicide was interpreted by many as an act of guilt and a final cowardly refusal to face accountability. Captain Elias Dunn, who had overseen the transport of numerous women into the Alden compound under the pretense of moral reform, avoided the worst of it by turning state's witness. In exchange for his cooperation, he received a dramatically reduced sentence. For survivors and the public alike, it was a bitter compromise, one that left the impression that justice had bent to convenience. In the scandal's wake, political careers crumbled like ash. Dozens of judges, aldermen, and officials were ousted from office. Though few served prison time, their reputations were permanently blackened. The trial transcripts became required reading for a nation suddenly confronted with how easily evil could dress itself in robes of morality. Several wealthy businessmen and prominent clergy members were also named in the proceedings. While many of them were only convicted on minor charges, conspiracy, perjury, or illegal donations, evidence suggested far deeper involvement. Secret meetings, personal notes, and coded financial transactions hinted that some of the very men who had once publicly condemned vice had in private bankrolled it. But wealth, as it often does, proved to be a shield. The same power and influence that had allowed these men to hide their crimes also softened their punishment. Their names may have been tarnished, but they retained their freedom. The scandal laid bare a painful truth in a world where appearances mattered more than principles, justice could be bought, and morality was a mask easily worn and easily removed. The fallout from the Alden family scandal rippled far beyond the courtroom. It did not end with verdicts or prison sentences. Instead, it marked a turning point in the way American society confronted the role of religious institutions, moral reform movements, and the state's responsibility toward its most vulnerable citizens. What had begun as whispers in a rural township became a national reckoning. The revelations forced the public to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems. They had long trusted systems that had claimed to rehabilitate, to redeem, to protect. In reality, they had enabled exploitation on a chilling scale. The Alden case laid bare the failure of oversight, the complicity of silence, and the danger of blind faith in self-appointed moral authorities. New York State, shaken by its complicity and desperate to reclaim public trust, enacted sweeping reforms. The very architecture of oversight was dismantled and rebuilt. Religious and charitable institutions that served vulnerable populations were now required to undergo regular unscheduled inspections. Detailed records of all residents, their treatments, and their visitors had to be maintained. Independent oversight boards completely removed from religious affiliation were established to ensure transparency and accountability. These reforms came to be known as the Alden Statutes, and they would become a national model. Other states quickly followed suit, inspired or perhaps frightened by what had been uncovered in New York. Where once there had been shadow, there was now at least the potential for light. And yet, some of the most profound consequences were not legal, they were cultural. The horror of the Alden family's crimes gave rise to a sharper, louder wave of feminist activism. Women's rights advocates, long dismissed or ignored, now had incontrovertible proof of what unchecked power could do to women hidden behind locked doors. Survivors who had once trembled behind closed courtroom walls emerged as voices of change, bearing witness, not just to their own trauma, but to the broader injustice of a society that had left them defenseless. Their testimonies became lightning rods for reform. Figures like Eleanor Whitcomb and Clara Devlin, themselves once faceless victims within the Alden's compound, became symbols of resistance and resilience. Prominent advocates such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton seized upon their stories, demanding legal reforms that would give women greater autonomy and protection from institutional abuse. The Alden case, they argued, was not an outlier. It was proof of a pattern, one in which women's lives were constrained by laws that treated them as property, their freedoms stolen, not just by individuals, but by entire systems built to police their morality. The very building that had once housed the Sanctuary of Moral Renewal, as the Aldens had ironically called their compound, was demolished in 1869. In a rare gesture of state-sanctioned shame, the city declared the land sacred to memory and forbade any construction on the site for the next 50 years. For decades, the lot stood vacant, an open wound in the middle of a growing city. In the 1920s, the ground was transformed into a modest, quiet park. There were no statues, no grand signs, only a discreet plaque honoring the unnamed and unnumbered victims. Still, many New Yorkers avoid the area to this day. They say the air feels heavier there. Wrong. Haunted. Most who walk past no longer know the reason. But the story persists, retold in whispers, family warnings, and urban legends passed from one generation to the next. It became a parable, a fable, a lesson wrapped in fear that those who speak with the loudest voice of virtue may be hiding the darkest sins. Writers of the late 19th century wove fragments of the Alden scandal into their novels, though even the most vivid fiction could never fully capture the monstrous reality. The case embedded itself into the country's collective memory, becoming part of its folklore. From dusty sermons in prairie churches to whispered warnings in tenement halls, the tale endured. But perhaps the most chilling lesson of the Alden case is this: true evil does not always come dressed as a monster. Sometimes it wears a collar. Sometimes it quotes scripture. Sometimes it smiles and offers salvation while holding a ledger soaked in blood. It showed how entire systems, legal, political, religious, could be manipulated to serve cruelty. How corruption does not always roar but often whispers behind mahogany desks and robed sanctuaries. How silence, when shared by too many, becomes complicity. The Alden legacy was not just one of pain but of awakening. It forced a nation to look inward and ask how many other sanctuaries had become prisons, how many other prophets were simply predators with pulpits, and how long had we mistaken obedience for virtue. The Alden family's monstrous operation could never have survived for over 3 decades without the deliberate support of dozens of officials and the quiet complicity of hundreds more. Judges, clergy, police officers, and bureaucrats who chose convenience over justice, who heard whispers and did nothing, who saw bruises and looked away, these people enabled evil. Their silence was not neutral. It was foundational. It took one man with relentless determination to finally break the silence. Detective Jonathan Flanagan, the investigator who ultimately exposed the Alden family's vast web of abuse, was promoted to captain soon after the case concluded. But his work didn't end with a single courtroom victory. Instead, he dedicated the rest of his career to uncovering similar horrors hiding in plain sight across the country. From Massachusetts to Missouri, he chased whispers through church basements, orphanages, and reform schools. Flanagan developed protocols that would eventually become the standard for investigating institutional abuse methods that emphasized listening to victims, first following money trails, and identifying behavioral patterns that pointed to systematic crimes rather than isolated incidents. His legacy is still felt in modern investigative procedures surrounding abuse in religious and charitable institutions. Another unlikely hero emerged from within the very institution the Aldens had once manipulated to mask their crimes. Father Elias Mercier, a humble parish priest, had begun keeping quiet records of parishioners who had mysteriously vanished after entering the Alden Run compound. His records, meticulous and heart-wrenching, helped Flanagan build a credible case when so many others refused to believe the unthinkable. In the years that followed, Father Mercier became a powerful voice for reform within the Catholic Church. His advocacy led to stricter reporting requirements and independent audits, aiming to ensure that no institution could ever again become a haven for hidden abuse under the guise of salvation. Just when the nation thought the full extent of the Aldens' crimes had finally been brought to light, an unthinkable discovery reopened wounds that had never truly healed. In 1934, nearly 70 years after the Alden compound had been dismantled, a construction crew working on renovations at the site made a horrifying find. Behind a false wall in what had once been the basement of the Sanctuary of Moral Renewal Workers, uncovered a hidden archive untouched, unspoken of, and deeply unsettling. Inside were hundreds of documents, photographs, and personal items that revealed previously unknown layers of the Aldens' operation. This was not just evidence, it was a roadmap of cruelty. There were detailed psychological evaluations of victims' handwritten logs of methods used to break human will, and internal memos describing various forms of mental and physical torment, all recorded with clinical detachment. But perhaps most horrifying were the photographs, hundreds of them. Images depicting staged rehabilitation sessions that were in truth systematic degradation. Experts believe these were not merely documentation for internal use, but entertainment for certain clients and trophies of domination. The archive also exposed something far larger, a network. Buried in the correspondence were letters exchanged between the Alden family and similar operations in London, Paris, Vienna, and beyond. These were not isolated monsters, they were part of an international infrastructure of exploitation. The letters discussed methods of avoiding legal scrutiny, trading women across borders, and refining psychological techniques to ensure total submission. This discovery shattered the comforting illusion that the Alden case had been a uniquely American tragedy. It was now clear the exploitation had been global, spreading under the guise of faith charity and moral reform. The infection was not national, it was cultural, and among the most damning pieces of evidence were the personal journals of Silas Alden himself, the patriarch of the family. Within those pages, Silas revealed the chilling theology he had constructed to justify his crimes. He did not see himself as a villain. He believed he was conducting religious experiments, testing the boundaries of human suffering and faith. In his eyes, pain was a gateway to purity, and submission a sign of spiritual progress. His entries are filled with twisted meditations on endurance, faith, and transformation, written with the tone of a scholar and the delusion of a prophet. He described his work as salvific suffering, convinced that he was unlocking truths about the soul by stripping it bare through agony. His journals were later studied by criminal psychologists who described them as a manifesto of theological sadism, a document that bridged religious language with systematic torture. What they reveal is a man who had long ceased to see his victims as human beings. To him, they were vessels, test subjects, objects on which to enact a divine hypothesis. And perhaps that was the most terrifying revelation of all, not that evil existed, but that it could be so coldly intellectualized, so neatly categorized in ledgers and letters, disguised in ritual and prayer.